Progressive World podcast with your hosts, Drea Klein-Bergman and John Daniele, brought to you by the Progressive World Federalists, a civil society organization that examines global policy through a progressive, anti-oppression lens.
Welcome back to the Progressive World podcast. I'm your host, John Daniele, a cyber policy and intelligence analyst.
And I'm Drea Klein-Bergman, a policy researcher.
In our special episode today, we're going to be talking about the attempted armed insurrection the world witnessed at the Capitol building of the United States and dive into the fascist ideology that inspired the right-wing extremist groups that participated in the event. At different points in my 20-year security career as a civilian forensics and intelligence analyst in policing and defense, I've collected or processed data and intelligence on extremist activities from across the political spectrum. While there are some commonalities between extremist groups and ideologies, there are also very marked differences. Today, I want to share a bit of what I've learned in examining the far-right extremist threat. But first, I'd like to start off the show by reading the Progressive World Federalists' official statement released this week on the events of January the 6th. What we witnessed on January 6th in the Capitol building of the United States of America was not a protest. This was an organized insurrection to defend a white supremacist president. It was a coup against a free and fair election for the presidency of the United States. This is fascism. And the long list of tragedies in the United States, from slavery to the genocide of indigenous peoples, the Dred Scott decision, Trail of Tears, and Jim Crow laws, just to name a few, there needs to be an authentic reckoning with the past. If we truly want to defend democracy and bring about global justice, then collectively, we need to hold these white supremacist fascists accountable. Sadly, Canada is not immune from the same type of hate and violence. Let's not forget that a Canadian-based political micro-targeting company in Victoria, BC, was directly implicated in the Cambridge Analytica scandal that was responsible for spreading far-right disinformation in support of Brexit and the fated 2016 US elections. Let's also not forget that the Conservative Party of Canada, following the events of January 6th, released an online advertising campaign falsely accusing Prime Minister Trudeau and the Liberal Party of engaging in electoral fraud in advance of the next election. Voting out fascism is clearly not working here in Canada. In addition, hate groups thrive here in Canada. One such example, the Proud Boys, was founded by Canadian Gavin McInnes, and most recently, researchers at the University of New Brunswick discovered 29 right-wing extremist groups that emerged in Atlantic Canada just within the last 4 years alone. The coup attempt operated for months in plain sight. Authorities were warned, and political leadership ignored the credible intelligence. The New York City Police Department's Intelligence and Counterterrorism Unit had compiled a detailed package for Capitol Police outlining credible and actionable intelligence on at least 12 individuals across the nation that had been involved in the planning of violent activities at the Capitol building. If we are truly to protect democracy around the globe, then we must be willing to hold accountable right-wing violent extremists and their political supporters for the spread of hate and violence.
And to be clear, here at PWF, we do not support or condone any kind of violence, especially political violence. The founders of our movement were pacifists, and as a movement, so are we. But I'm seeing on social media and in the news the term domestic terrorism alongside political violence with what happened this past week. John, can you please tell us the difference between these two things so we can actually recognize it?
In order to understand what terrorism is, it's first important to understand that political violence is not monolithic. While it's easy to say that any politically motivated act of violence is terrorism, the reality is much more nuanced. Political violence manifests itself on a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, there's protest-oriented violence, such as vandalism, rioting, and mob violence. And on the other hand, you have insurrection, insurgency, and revolution. Terrorism is a form of political violence that bridges these two in the middle. So it's important to recognize that not all political violence meets the legal definition of terrorism. In Canada, Section 83.01 of the Criminal Code defines terrorism as, and I quote, a conspiracy, threat, act, attempted act, or omission that is committed in whole or in part for a political, religious, or ideological purpose, objective, or cause, and with the intention of intimidating the public or a segment of the public with regard to its security, including its economic security, or compelling a person, a government, or a domestic and an international organization to do or refrain from doing any act that intentionally causes death or serious bodily harm by use of violence, endangers a person's life, causes a serious risk to the health or safety of the public or any segment of the public, causes substantial property damage, causes serious interference with or disruption of an essential service, facility, or system, other than as a result of advocacy, protest, dissent, or stoppage of work that is not intended to result in the conduct or harm previously referred. This differs slightly in the context of the United States, which defines terrorism as involving acts dangerous to human life that are in violation of the criminal laws of the United States or of any state, intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, influence the policy of a government by intimidation, or affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. So by this definition, the events that occurred at the US Capitol building in DC this past week may turn out to meet the legal definition of terrorism in the United States. The event was advertised quite openly across far-right communities online as a coordinated, armed march at the US Capitol building with the objective of stopping the vote to certify President-elect Biden's victory. A gallows was assembled on site. There was a violent storming of the Capitol building, and once inside, an officer was bludgeoned to death as an armed mob attempted to penetrate the chambers. 2 improvised explosive devices were set at the DNC and RNC offices to draw police away from the center of the attack, and men with zip tie or flex cuff restraints roamed the hallways looking for senators and congresspeople to take a gunpoint while chanting "Death to Pence" and carrying white supremacist flags, including the Nazi flag and the Confederate flag. It should also be noted that many of these insurrectionists demonstrated intimate knowledge of the complex layout of the Capitol buildings. By contrast, the political violence characterized by so-called antifa in clashes with neo-Nazis or police at protests constitutes simple assault and vandalism, or the black bloc tactics that have emerged from the WTO protests in Seattle around the turn of the millennium that have now become commonplace at larger demonstrations in the form of looting and riots or flaming trash cans and cars, while worrisome and distressing and criminal, does not meet the legal definition of terrorism. While it's also true that not all political extremists possess the will to violence, politically extreme ideologies, when combined with other factors such as deeply held grievances, profound loss, economic distress, or perceived loss of social status, power, or privilege can become a conduit to violent extremism for some people.
And let's not forget to point out why they were there in the first place. It began with a big lie that the election was stolen, and that was started by the President of the United States and perpetuated by most of the GOP politicians. And the surest way to kill democracy is to go after the facts. You lie a lot and all the time. You say that the media is fake and can't be trusted. And then you can build a following of people that can no longer distinguish between the truth and a lie. And when that has happened successfully, then democracy doesn't stand a chance. The threat wasn't just about these white supremacists storming the Capitol. It also came from inside. GOP donors, ex-military, ex-cops. We have 74 million plus people that voted for Trump in 2020. Even if 1% of these individuals were prepared to be engaged in violence, that's just shy of 1 million people overall. 1 million potentially violent extremists in your communities. Oy. So fascism. We've heard this word a lot in the era of Trump. So let's start with the basics. John, can you describe what that is, juxtaposed against democracy and free and fair elections?
So, fascism similarly exists on a spectrum, which is why it's often difficult to pin down a specific set of policies that could be said to be inherently fascist. It's also a multifaceted threat combining not only political and economic dimensions, but cultural, aesthetic, and ritualistic dimensions as well. So when we look at historical fascism, we see variations in expression between Italian fascism, German Nazism, Spanish Francoism. However, there are some key narrative themes that are common across this historical fascist landscape. From an intellectual perspective, fascism was a reactionary movement opposed to the rise of Enlightenment values, which was seen to have upended the traditional order by the end of the 19th century, along with the rich cultural legacy of the people. This is why fascists throughout history have made emotional appeals to reclaim the nation's noble and ancient but forgotten heritage. Historically, this meant tying the fascist enterprise to the legacy of Roman imperialism. Today, this narrative lives on with modern appeals to reclaim the moral greatness of the American Revolutionary War by the Tea Party movement, for example, or the European identitarian movement's association of European identity with Sparta and the Greco-Persian Wars, which is leveraged to formulate the myths surrounding the birth of European identity. In fact, the logo of the white nationalist organization Identity Europa is the Greek letter lambda, which is a tip of the hat to this Spartan myth. In North America, white nationalist groups have also leveraged Spartan symbolism, most recently at the storming of the US Capitol building, where a flag was seen with the phrase, "Come and take them," memorializing the words spoken by Spartan king Leonidas to the Persian king Xerxes in response to Xerxes' request to lay down their spears in return for their lives. It is this appeal to traditionalism and antiquity that's a common rhetorical narrative leveraged by all fascist movements.
And watching these horrific scenes unfold at the Capitol was like watching Bros Gone Wild. And I keep hearing leaders and people say, this isn't America, this isn't us kind of sentiment. But if anyone takes a closer look at our history in North America, I would say this very much is us. A police officer was murdered by a mob. Now that this veneer of Blue Lives Matter has been shattered this past week, can you tell us a little bit more about how this North American breed of fascism plays out here?
Well, another common narrative leveraged by fascists, as evidenced by the use of the Spartan symbolism, is the glorification of the hegemonic masculine ideal. The view that men, by their competitive and aggressive nature, ought to be dominant in society over women. And the ideal man, so to speak, would exhibit these natural tendencies to compete, to fight, to dominate, and win. So, in this sense, brawn and military application of power is closer to the fascist masculine ideal than intelligence, reason, and diplomacy, which are considered by many fascists to be effeminate traits. This, of course, reinforces the anti modernist, anti intellectual, and anti feminist mindset of fascism, which appeals to a more functionalist view of society that values traditional gender norms. This is why in fascism, the role of the father is exalted, the adventurous pursuits of the warrior are celebrated, whereas the role of women are to sacrifice their bodies to ensure the continuity and the glory of the so-called fatherland. Fertility and motherhood therefore constitute the feminine ideal to fascists. Today, this anti-feminist misogyny lives on in the white nationalist alternative right movement, or alt-right, that are obsessed with gender identity and are vehemently opposed to modern gender studies and the concept of gender fluidity. This is where you see a lot of crossover and interplay between the alt-right and the so-called quote-unquote manosphere, which is a network of websites and online forums that aggressively advocate hypermasculine and anti-feminist, anti-women's rights attitudes and beliefs, characterized by pickup artist communities, men going their own way communities, and the involuntary celibate or incel online community of masculine extremists whose misogynistic speech has inspired mass violence, such as the Isla Vista massacre in 2014, or the Toronto van attack in 2018, or the massage parlor murder this past year that's been referred to by Toronto police as incel terrorism, a classification that's been the subject of much controversy and debate among those studying traditional forms of violent extremism. But let's also not forget that this past Christmas in downtown Nashville, we had a radicalized QAnon supporter that bombed the city.
And from the stats, it seems we have more young and educated white men that are joining the fold. And going back to the coup of the Capitol, there was, a lot of ex-cops and ex-military. Your average middle and upper class Americans were involved with this. It was not just your angry, poor white male. How are they grabbing these folks?
So underscoring all of this is fascism's use of what's called the classical heroic narrative to inspire young, mostly white, angry men to heed the call to pick up arms and engage in the cosmic fight against what they perceive as a great battle between the forces of good against the forces of evil, ostensibly in the form of the progressive left, feminists, the LGBTQIA plus community, and so-called global elites, all of whom in the modern fascist imagination are conspiring to usher in an era of unrestricted mass migration, causing demographic shifts that threaten white prevalence in Western society and undermines the idea of quote-unquote white culture, along with introducing a cultural Marxist agenda to undermine the hyper-masculine ideal and effeminize men, cause the destruction of traditional marriage and the collapse of the nuclear family construct, as well as the imposition of communism to impoverish the nation, regulation and big government to lower competitiveness, and finally ring the death knell on Christianity and bring about the so-called Islamization of the West. These are the perverse and outlandish narratives being leveraged by far-right movements today to make fascism appeal to a whole new audience. Modern fascism is no longer about achieving autarky through state capitalism or the glorification of peasant identity or even advocating for totalitarian control over society, as it is about politicizing and exploiting the inherent fears of a society in transition.
Okay, got it. Oversimplify everything, boil it down to good versus evil, which makes it much easier to understand and get behind this insane rhetoric.
Exactly. So fascism is not necessarily a cohesive political ideology as much as it is an instrument of narrative warfare. Fascism is the method by which right-wing authoritarians achieve power. It engenders hero worship and demagoguery. It glorifies the national myths of the state, reinforces traditionalism, militarism, and the hypermasculine ethic, and identifies an outgroup of perceived enemies, including internal enemies, that threaten to displace the predominant ethnic majority and allegedly undermine their associated cultural values and way of life.
So now that we understand this definition of fascism and what we can classify these events of January 6th, can you take us into their thoughts and perspectives on why fascists and white supremacists act the way they do? So more into like the who and the what and the how and the why.
So earlier I mentioned that the inherent fear that modern fascists prey upon is that immigration will cause a demographic replacement of the white majority in Western society. This concept was derived from the ideas of the French Nouvelle Droite or newright philosophers whose writings became prominent in fringe right-wing circles by the 1970s and continues to exert influence on the far right today. The French New Right critic and novelist Renaud Camus in 2012 wrote a book entitled Le Grand Remplacement, or The Great Replacement, where he suggested that white Europeans are being displaced by the mass influx of migrants and refugees fleeing war, economic depression, and food scarcity from the Near East and North Africa in what he calls an extinction level event. In his book, Camus specifically points to the increasing prevalence of the Spanish language in the United States as further evidence of this widespread, quote unquote, ethnic and civilizational substitution. This concept has since been adopted by fringe right-wing commentators, think tanks, and policy institutions, which have helped to normalize these false ideas within conservative movements worldwide.
And we've seen it work really, really well. And it's all I hear these days. The perfect example for me that pops out is, they putting kids in cages and separating from their mothers, and that's somehow okay and not unchristian.
Well, President Trump often invoked this theme to raise fears about the number of undocumented immigrants and migrant workers from Mexico living in the United States. Similarly, at the Fascist Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where progressive activist Heather Heyer was brutally killed by a white nationalist who rammed his car into a crowd of peaceful counter-protesters, the phrase, "Jews will not replace us," became a common rallying cry. Here in Canada, we have fringe right-wing politicians such as Maxime Bernier, who have raised concerns about demographic replacement. And new Conservative Party leader Aaron O'Toole has also promoted these themes with his political ad campaign to, quote unquote, take back Canada. The prevalence of this theme in both mainstream conservative, fringe right-wing, and far-right media has evoked widespread anxiety among a huge cross-section of the white population in Western societies.
And I don't think we should let our Canadian politicians off the hook when they're wearing Trump mega regalia here in Canada, and they're helping spread these lies to their constituents.
And as a result, a new skepticism of multiculturalism has emerged among white voters who identify from center right to center left alike. This is exactly what founding new right philosophers such as Alain de Benoit sought to achieve. That is, the development of a syncretic political ideology that transcended the traditional left-right dialectic. Nowhere is this more evident than in Italy, where fascist organization Casa Pound has emerged to represent the left-wing ideals of class equality among the fascist movements of Italy. In Europe, such fascist organizations were referred to as third positionists, which first emerged from the socialist wing of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party in Germany, before the so-called Red Contingent was wiped out by Hitler during the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. In the late 90s, Russia sought to harness the ideology of third positionists to formulate an effective strategy to divide the West. Kremlin-backed philosopher and fringe mystic Alexander Dugin was therefore tapped to help craft a philosophy predicated on a neo-fascist Eurasianist identity to be used to reinforce the concept of Russia as a quote-unquote state civilization. He dubbed his radical anti-Western philosophy fourth political theory and suggested that historical, geographical, linguistic, and cultural similarities between the peoples of the former Tsarist and Soviet Empire formed a separate and distinct Eurasian civilization that stood in contrast to what he called the Romano-Germanic culture of the Central and Western Europe, or the so-called Atlanticist culture of the UK and America. He further posited in his book entitled The Foundations of Geopolitics that Russia could dominate the West by expanding its territory through forging new alliances, engaging in annexation, and encouraging political division and ethnic, social, and racial conflict in the United States. He envisioned that Russia would leverage its secret services to actively support all dissident movements, political extremists, white supremacists, and other sectarian groups to thereby destabilize the internal political processes of the United States and strengthen its isolationist tendencies.
I'm really glad you brought this up, John. I think it's really important to make these connections. Can you talk a little further about this and especially how it made its way here to North America?
Sure. These ideas were refined by the Russian strategic thinker General Valery Gerasimov into what became known as the Gerasimov Doctrine, which combined political and narrative warfare with cyber warfare and maskirova, or the Russian doctrine of military deception. This is exactly the strategy that Russia employed during the US elections in 2016 to foment division in American society by creating an online troll factory called the Internet Research Agency that magnified both extreme left and extreme right points of view through fake social media accounts on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. At one point, Russia promoted Black Lives Matter themes on the one hand, while also promoting physical violence against Black Lives Matter protesters on the other.
So Russia was successful then?
What should be understood is that Russia didn't succeed in fomenting new political divisions in America. They merely exploited existing political fault lines. The extreme polarization that exists in American politics today is a homegrown problem. While globalization and the automation of the workforce has enabled American corporate profits to soar, it's also decimated the power of labor unions. It's caused long-term unemployment among low-skill workers and has triggered community decline, which has disproportionately affected red states the most.
John, that's really no joke. I was just reading some stats by the EPI, and it scared the hell out of me. The CEO compensation has grown 940% since 1978, versus your typical worker during the same period has grown 12%. This really has elevated this rise in inequality that you were just talking about, and we have been experiencing it here in North America for the last 30 years.
And these poor socioeconomic outcomes have also led to the declining rates of college admission in nearly all red states across the USA, particularly in the South. The result of this is a rather legitimate grievance among poor, predominantly white Americans in these states that their families have been unable to reap the benefits of globalization. It doesn't help that Republican policy for decades has been focused on radical fiscal austerity, a ballooning of the defense budget, and mass deregulation of industry, which has negatively impacted the livelihood, the health, and well-being of poor Americans the most, while pursuing ever-increasing tax breaks accessible only to big corporations and wealthy Americans.
And this was done very, very well over the years. And we see this at play during COVID. You have millions of people out of work and losing their health insurance in the United States. They don't have enough food. They're losing their homes, their apartments. And meanwhile, we see the GOP telling people there isn't enough money for quote unquote handouts. Meanwhile, corporations were once again bailed out by Congress. The wealthy continue to have their ridiculous tax breaks that were passed by the Trump administration, and they're actually making money from the pandemic. And people are not leaving the GOP. Mitch McConnell was reelected during a pandemic in Kentucky to the Senate, and his constituents are amongst the poorest in the country.
All it took to light this powder keg of anxiety and grievance were movements like the Republican Tea Party, or later the Make America Great Again movement of President Trump, which laid blame for America's rural decline on liberals, refugees, and immigrants, shadowy global elites, socialism, or people of color advocating for the safety, security, and prosperity of their own neglected communities. These are the themes that modern American fascists have exploited to gain acceptance, prominence, and power for their ideology within conservative movements worldwide. They magnify white anxiety about the demographic changes in our world that are the result of political and economic instability and corruption, famine, and war. They misdirect blame for rural decline on liberals, globalists, and minority groups, as opposed to the drawbacks of a modern economy in transition. And finally, they've become willful pawns of a foreign power that share their hatred of democracy and the liberal values of freedom, equality, and human rights.
Wow. Thank you, John. I think I'd like to end with a couple of powerful quotes. The first is from Jerry Saltz, who published his article entitled "Posted Live from the Inferno" in The Vulture on the 13th of January. And I quote, "In the pictures of that day, I see totemism, tribal warfare, incompetence, half-madness, vengeance, white privilege, rage, cruelty. These pictures are what would happen if Facebook became flesh. These are people all speaking at once to everyone else, all claiming that their facts are real and everyone else's are fake. We hear the laughing, the chants of hang Mike Pence, the members of the mob asking where the bathrooms are. On Parler and Newsmax, I watched invaders watching themselves on their own social media platforms. The feedback loop was astonishing and insane. The moment transformed into a sort of collective far-right group portrait." End quote. The second quote is from an article written by historian Timothy Snyder, published on the 9th of January in the New York Times, entitled "The American Abyss." Post-truth is pre-fascism, and Trump has been our post-truth president. When we give up on truth, we concede power to those with a wealth and charisma to create spectacle in its place. Without agreement about some basic facts, citizens cannot form the civil society that would allow them to defend themselves. If we lose the institutions that produce facts that are pertinent to us, then we tend to wallow in attractive abstractions and fictions. America will not survive the big lie just because a liar is separated from power. It will need a thoughtful repluralization of media and a commitment to facts as a public good. The racism structured into every aspect of the coup attempt is a call to heed our own history. Serious attention to the past helps us to see risks but also suggests future possibility. We cannot be a democratic republic if we tell lies about race, big or small. Democracy is not about minimizing the vote nor ignoring it, neither a matter of gaming nor of breaking a system, but of accepting the equality of others, heeding their voices, and counting their votes." End quote. Getting back to Canada and our growing threat to fascism here at home, hate crimes remain underreported and are difficult to prosecute under the law. Today, there are more than 300 hate groups openly and freely operating in Canada. And let's note that the government is just too slow to put anything concrete into action. I also want to help create some concrete action where we can, as citizens, put an end to this. Enough is enough is enough. What can we, as anti-fascist citizens, do to stop this, John?
I think what we need is a whole of society approach, as is the case with any really complex challenges. There's a role for churches, synagogues, and mosques to play in ensuring that extremist ideologies do not take root in our spiritual communities. There's also a role that schools and civil society organizations play in ensuring that historical narratives about the birth of the nation and colonialism are taught in an honest and transparent manner. Lastly, our democratic societies must begin to develop more compelling narratives than the ones offered by fascism to inspire constructive forms of citizen engagement and evoke pride in what should become bipartisan values such as personal freedom, social equity, and diversity. In addition to this, the government should form an independent body comprised of representatives from civil society organizations, religious groups, mental health experts, and custody nurse practitioners working alongside law enforcement with the mandate to monitor online hate groups and counter violent extremism within our communities. Criminal charges or significant fines must also be given to more broadly deter incitement to violence. This independent body must also be transparent in its reporting and accountability. It must also engage in outreach to big tech and encourage them to develop new technologies to help identify online hate and violent extremist groups at scale. Lastly, adequate safeguards to ensure freedom of speech is necessary, and a democratic appeals process is essential to ensuring fairness.
Thank you, John. We have a lot of work to do. And as always, it's a pleasure to discuss these things with you. And you have really scared the shit out of me.
You've been listening to the Progressive World podcast, brought to you by the Progressive World Federalists. You can reach us through our website at www.progressiveworldfederalist.com. Join us in advocating for stronger global democratic institutions, the decolonization of the international system, and global justice reform.